Welcome. Let's get started. My name is Helen, and I'm here today to tell you about containers in Azure and specifically helping you get started with containers in Azure. So this is like an entry-level talk. You need to know what Azure is, you need to know what containers are, and you should know what Docker does, but that's about the level of knowledge you need. So manager level talk. Developers also welcome. Let's dive in. Getting your containers into Azure. This is like the 3 messages I want you to take with you when you leave this session today. I want to show you that this is not rocket science. You can do this. Mikael, you can do this. You have several options that are good for different things, and I want to briefly show them to you so you can make an informed choice between them, and then we'll actually try them out, several of them. So that's the plan for this session now. As an agenda, what options do you have in Azure for getting your container into the cloud? You have at least 4 options that I found. They're all named very similarly, and in some situations it doesn't matter which one you pick, but they are actually different. But the naming is like, it doesn't help you much to figure out what's good for what. You have Azure Container Instances. You have Azure Web Apps for containers. You have Azure Container Apps. So like we've got apps everywhere and containers everywhere. And you've got Azure Kubernetes Services, or AKS. So those are the 4 main options if you want to get your stuff, your containers into Azure. I will be using Azure Portal today to show this to you, most of it, because it's nice for exploring and discovering. You can sort of see what alternatives there are. You can see all the things you can tweak on these offerings. But if you actually do this for real, you probably wouldn't use Azure Portal most of the time. Almost, or like pretty much, I think 100% of this you can do from the command line. I just find it sort of less discoverable. It doesn't show you much of the capabilities. So even though for real you do it in command line, today we're going to stick to the web interface. Before we can go into Azure, we actually need something to put there. So you need to, I've done some preparation for you. And you need to do some preparation if you want to do this for real. There are things I won't cover here. I won't help you set up your Docker image or install Docker. I've done that before. I will show it to you in a moment. Also, what I've done in advance is I have signed up for a trial Azure subscription. You can do it for free. So literally I'm doing this in a free trial that you get for 30 days and it costs you nothing. And I've also installed the Azure command line interface, and you can just Google for it, download the installation file, click, and you're done. But I'm just not going to spend any time on that. What I will show you today is how you, the point where I will start is showing how you get your Docker image into Azure. So we're going to look at the Azure subscription. We're going to create an Azure container registry and then upload an image there. So that's sort of the, before we get to the fun bits, we'll actually look at what Azure has to offer to you. And the subscription I've done, but the other bits we're going to do. So actually, having done that, let's switch over to the Azure portal. If you've seen Azure before, you recognize this. If you haven't, then it's just portal.azure.com. That's where you go, and that's where you get this all this stuff. I have created my Helen's free trial here, my subscription. And this is the sort of the overall container for everything you do in your work in Azure. Underneath the subscription, you have things called resource groups. And the resource group is a logical container for a project or like a system that you work with. So everything that goes together, you keep it together in a resource group. And I'm going to do that straight away. Let's start with that. We're going to create a resource group for this. 4.7 stars in Azure, great stuff. And let's call it, let's see if Knowabunga is available as a word. Yes, I can use Knowabunga as a name. Nobody's used it before. And Azure Global Offering, you can put it wherever you want. We're closest to North Europe, so we'll stick to North Europe so we get good response times. Create. Bam, we have our resource group. This is, will I just lose sound in the room? Can you hear me anyway? I can speak loudly? Yes, good. Do we know if the stream still has sound? Yes, good stuff. So, a resource group to contain all the resources we will be creating. The first resource we will create is a container registry. And it's yet another layer of containers for other things, buckets to put your stuff in. But whereas a resource group can contain anything, a container registry specifically contains containers, holds containers, let's put it that way. We'll go back to the home page, create a resource, and I can just search here for container registry. Container registry. So we have a bucket where we can put our Docker images. I have a resource group for this. Everything needs to be in a resource group. That's like, there needs to be a bucket for everything. Let's give it a name. I'm going to be really creative in our naming and call everything Knowabunga today, so I don't mix things up. We don't really care about any of the details. Let's just create it. This gives me now a bucket for all my containers. So now I need to take my container, which I will show to you in a moment. Let's look at my container. I have a super simple Docker file. Can you see this? So maybe I should zoom in a little bit. There we go. I start from a base from an Nginx base image, and then I just have a folder of static HTML that I copy into that image, and that's all the development work I put into this. And because I am a lazy developer and my memory is not very good, I always also have a Docker Compose file, which I use to run this locally, so I don't need to remember how to, like, in what order the parameters need to come and where the ports go and all that. So let's just see this in action. Can I zoom this as well? Doesn't want to zoom. I will type here Docker Compose up, which will, just to prove to you that I actually have a container that actually works. It is up and running, and I will go to localhost 8080. Bam, website in a container. Stylish, right? It's got fonts and things. But this is just on my computer, right? And this is a starting point. This is where we actually want to start doing the fun stuff. So now we need to get this into the container registry. And I just realized that I forgot to enable a setting, but I'm sure it's going to remind me about that later. So now we switch to the command line. We don't need to look at that container anymore. We need to log in to sort of connect to the container registry so that we can start working with it. Then we need to tag our container, and then we need to push our container. So it's 3 steps to get this container up into the cloud, where it won't be running, but it will be available to us. So this is where the Azure command line interface comes in. I'm typing AZ for Azure, ACR login, and I'm specifying that the name of the container registry is Knowabunga. And this is already failing. Did I type? Did I? Knowabunga. Azure ACR login. I think the registry is no. Did I type it wrong over here? Yeah. Where do I have the name there? Overview, deployment complete, resource group, go to resource. Let's see, what did I actually type? Knowabunga. Good catch, thank you. That's going to haunt me now the rest of the day here. Okay, we are logged in. Now we're going to do Docker tag containers in Azure, which is what I called my container. And we tag it with Knowabunga. Horrible. Azure cr.io containers in Azure v1. No such image. This is next typo. There we go, better. And now we do docker push Knowabunga Azure cr.io containers in Azure v1. This is our container flying up into the cloud. This takes less than a minute if everything works correctly. And we're done, and we're switching back here, and now we're in our container registry. We can look at the repositories, which is yet another layer of buckets of that hold things. And this repository now, this list of repositories has a repo for our containers in Azure. And if I look at it closely, I have a tag called v1. So my first version of my Docker image is now in the cloud, available for us to work with. This was all preparation. This is not the fun stuff. This is just the prep work. Let me switch back to prep, which we've done. Docker image in Azure Container Registry. Now, the actual 4 options that we had. The first one, Azure Container Instance. This is the most basic of them all. This is literally just a container in the cloud. It is super easy to set up. You pay for it per second. So if it's not running, you pay nothing. And it's the cost per second depends on how much resources you allocate to it, like CPU and memory. And because you pay per second, this is a really great option for temporary short-lived workloads. So, for example, if you want to run build agents in the cloud, for example, or you want to do data processing jobs, or just experiments like we're doing here. I just have this container and I want to get it up in the cloud and see how it behaves and what do other people think about it. Let's try this out. Switching back to the Azure Portal, we go to the home page, we go to create a resource. And on the left here, you can see the categories of things you can choose, all these offerings available to you. We're working with containers. So we go to the containers tab here, and container instances is the first choice. First and simplest. Let's try one of those. Again, we have the subscription, we have the resource group. We are going to call this Knowabunga, spelled right this time. We have the option here to just, if we're experimenting and trying things out, to take a quick start, like a demo image from Azure, but we have one of our own. So I'm getting it from the Azure Container Registry. It's all, yeah, this is the option that I forgot to enable previously. We need admin access there, so we're going to do in a different tab. Go back to our container registry, access keys, and we enable the admin user. That should be good enough for it. Let's try again. Knowabunga, container registry, the one that we have. Pre-fills all this stuff for us because it only finds a single image and a single tag on it. So no choices here to make. We don't really need to care about the size of this either or the networking stuff. We can just go ahead and create it. That's good enough for this demo purposes. So how many clicks have we done? 10 clicks maybe? And with this last create click, that was it. Like that's all the options, all the choices you need to make to get a basic Azure container instance up and running. And I'm doing this again, I'm doing this in a free trial that also took like 2 minutes to set up. So the setup, the time to get started here is counts in minutes, not hours. There's like no approvals or I didn't even need to enter credit card details. This is all just free stuff. We'll give it a minute to complete deploying. It shouldn't take longer than that. And then I just want to prove to you that it actually works. I want to show it to you. And I also want to show you a little bit about what options we have available, what things we can tweak and toggle here. So we're going to go to the resource, which it now has created for us. This, if you're not familiar with Azure Portal, the left side here shows you all the aspects of this resource that you can work with. And this really isn't much. Like, you know, some of the space is taken up by the support requests and tags. So it's you can see this is basic tool here, but it's here and it's going to work. So we're going to copy the IP address here, go to a new tab, and I'm pretty sure I need to specify the port here. There we go. Website running in a container, now in the cloud. Whoa, isn't it? Really whoa. So this was quick, this was easy, but you see it's kind of clunky if we want to use this for a web application. Like we didn't get HTTPS or anything. We're working with a raw IP address. We got no support here, like for setting up anything more. So this is again awesome for short-lived workloads, but not really made for web applications. But if we switch back to the PowerPoint here, the next thing is made for web applications. Azure Web Apps for Containers. You can hear from the name that this is really web adapted. This is also super easy to set up. It's going to be roughly the same number of clicks, and we're going to see it in a minute. The smallest size is free, again, so if you're just sort of maybe experimenting, maybe not quite sure that Azure is the right thing for you or whether this is the right offering for you, you can try it out for free and see whether you like the capabilities that gives you. And this is really going to be optimized for web workloads, which we're going to see when we actually try it out. So let's do it. Create a web app for containers. Back to home, back to create the resource. In the containers area, again, we get this nice guidance here, web app for containers. And you can also see here, I just want to, like, I'm going to sound like such a fangirl from Microsoft here, but their documentation is awesome. It's super well written, and there's tutorials, and there's like, how do you choose between the different offerings? So if you haven't been there, if you need help, then like trust the documentation, because it's like they really invested tons of effort in making this developer friendly. We're not going to look at it now, but if you need more information, there's literally like pages and pages worth, and it's all really well done. You recognize this by now. Subscription, resource group. It needs a name. Let's call it Knowabunga. It's going to be a Docker container. It's not going to be in the central US because that's going to be slow. We're in North Europe. And again, it allocates some basic size for it, which I'm sure we could change if we wanted. But this is such a tiny website, tiny web app, so we don't even need to care about that. I'm going to just click through the tabs here just because we don't care about the deployment, but we do care about the Docker tab here because we don't want a quick start. We want our own nice website here. So we are in the Knowabunga registry, and again, fills up the stuff nicely for us. We don't care about monitoring or tags, so let's just go right to the last step here, which is a review and create. Happy with all that, I'm sure. Let's create it. This will take a minute. Let's wait for it to finish, because this time we are going to take more of a look at what's available on the left, because there are things that are actually interesting, useful, and relevant for us there. Now that we, specifically because we happen to have a web container, we could do lots of nice things with it. There we go. Again, less than a minute to create. And now, just by the size of the scroll bar, you see that we've got plenty more options here. And for example, we have things like deployment. So this thing has support for at least GitHub Actions and possibly other like built-in support to easily deploy things. It's got deployment slots. So you could have 2 slots with the same application in it. You deploy to one while the other is running, and then you can, which helps you do 0 downtime deployments. Or, for example, A/B tests, or any other kind of experiments that you want to have multiple slots running for the same website with the same URL. So you can specify like send 10% to this slot and 90% to the other. You get configuration support, which is like app settings if you're thinking of the .NET world, or environment variables. So you can run at runtime configure your application. You get SSL support pretty much built in, custom domain support. Scaling is made easy for you here. You can scale up or scale out. You've got SSH access to things. You've got alerts and metrics and logs and health checks, and like this would literally just take days to explore all of this. So this is a much more powerful resource type, or much more powerful offering than the previous one, if what you're working with is a web container. But I'm not going to spend time on all of that right now. I just want to show you that this works. Look, we even got a URL for us, knowabunga.azurewebsites.net. This time we're not working with the raw IP address. We even got SSL automatically. So a lot of work is done for you, and all of your work is enabled for you. So it should be really easy to get this running the way you want and you need. Let's switch back to the presentation. So we've gone through Azure Container Instances, which is literally just an instance of a container in the cloud, and Azure Web Apps for Containers, which is web apps, container adapted. And the third offering in the list is Azure Container Apps. This is a super fresh thing. I think it literally came less than a month ago, and it's still in beta or preview. I honestly admit I haven't explored it as much as I might have, because it's new and I'm actually working on other things. But this, I think, the impression I get is like this is the future for containers in Azure. Microsoft describes it as serverless hosting for container apps. So it's it's serverless, as in you don't need to care about all the infrastructure underneath, but it gives you a lot more power, and it's for applications in a way that the previous offerings have not been. It is still easy to set up, but there's going to be new terminology, so it's like one step up in the level of complexity. We can still do point and click all the way through, like we don't need to script anything, but there are terms to learn. And it's got new kinds of bells and whistles. It's based on, under the hood, it's based on Kubernetes, but it doesn't give you access to all the raw Kubernetes configuration and administration features. But if you know Kubernetes, then you're going to recognize some of the terminology that's going to come up. And the way Microsoft describes this new tool is that it's great for apps and specifically microservices. So because it's Kubernetes under the hood, it's kind of running in a cluster. So all the different containers you might have in these container apps, they should be able to really easily talk to each other and sort of communicate and collaborate. I haven't tried it out, so I'm just trusting Microsoft promises here, and we're not going to explore all of those details today either. But I just want to show it to you as a sort of what might be the way forward for future work with containers in Azure. So let's try this out. Let's create a container app. Back to our usual place. We go home, we create a resource, we go to containers, and 3 weeks ago when I started preparing this presentation, this didn't even turn up in this popular products thing. You had to search for it, you had to know it's there, but it's come up in popularity enough so that now it's number 5 in this list here. So it's getting attention, but it's still in preview, which also makes it slightly hard to evaluate exactly how good is it going to be and how many features and bells and whistles will it have. And I'm going to show you in a minute what I mean by that. So I'm going to call this Knowabunga again. This needs a container app environment, which doesn't really explain what it's doing. So I'm just sort of accepting that I need this apparently for some reason. No, I did not. Log Analytics Workspace. Create new. Knowabunga. This goes Knowabunga here. Knowabunga here. Was I in the wrong resource group, did you say? Yeah. Let's not do that. That's going to be bad. So, container app. Knowabunga. Let's keep things together. I'm going to be really good at spelling Knowabunga by the end of this because I'll get lots of practice now. I need to create new here. This is where we do. Knowabunga. Okay. Knowabunga. Yes. We again don't want a quick start image. We want our own. So we call it Knowabunga. We get our image from the container registry, our bucket with Docker images. Give us Knowabunga. Give us containers in Azure, v1. And I'm going to ignore the CPU and memory because our web app is again really tiny and it should be able to run on pretty much anything. Here is where the new terminology starts coming in. We have something called an ingress. And it doesn't really explain to you, like it just says you need an ingress if you have an HTTP endpoint. If you're familiar with Kubernetes, you will recognize the term. Ingress is something that you have to set up in Kubernetes. This kind of lets the Kubernetes terminology leak up into the interface here. And like if you're in the know, you kind of figure out that this is probably something to do with Kubernetes. And this is something you may want to read up on if you actually want to use this. But at the same time, this is like a serverless offering, so you can ignore the details of what an ingress is and why you need it and what it does. It just tells you need it for an HTTP, which we want. So therefore, we'll just accept this suggestion and just go ahead with it. I hope I didn't skip any important settings in the other tabs. Let's get that deployed. And you have to be impressed by Microsoft's ability, just like the performance of this. From the moment that I click, they must run some magic scripts and set up all sorts of virtual machines. And literally within minutes of my clicks, I've got my stuff running and all these different kinds get created almost equally fast. But this time, we're actually going to get, like it's generating a list of things for us here. The first one is created, the next one are coming, which again gives us a hint of like there's stuff going on under the hood that we're not quite getting the full details and explanations for. And I imagine that this will come as this container apps offering sort of matures. There may be more visibility into what's going on underneath and why it needs all these different things and what they're good for. Right now, it's not quite as well explained as the previous one we looked at. This has like things happening that are not quite, to me, to my preference, is not explained well enough. Why is it creating all the things and what does it need these for? And again, we see here again, it's doing things with Cube in the background. So Kubernetes is doing stuff that's sort of semi-hidden, but still somehow leaking out into the user interface for us. Even more things. But now I think this one is called the container app, so I think it's now actually doing the final one of them, the last, most detailed level. Go to resource. And at the moment here on the left, it looks pretty empty, like very sparse. Not much you can do here by the looks of it. Again, I'm not sure how final this is. From the description, but like the way Microsoft markets this, I'm expecting this to expand more in the future. But who knows? So right now we have access to at least continuous deployment. And this is also like GitHub Actions, so you can get stuff here pretty easily in an automated way. We have access to the ingress details. which I see now I must have missed to enable, because this should say here, good thing we came here exploring. We want this enabled, and we want our port configured here as well. One of the things that you get here for free is logs, application insight logs, if I remember correctly. You get this for free without having to configure anything on your own. This is like some of the things that it was creating that was not very well explained was like containers for the logs. You also get here revision management, which one of the things you can use it for is, again, like A/B deployments or A/B testing or multiple versions running at the same time. If we look more closely here, revision management, if I create a new revision, there's a tab called Scale here. So this Azure Container Apps gives you tools for automatically scaling your containers up and down. And you do this using scale rules, which I haven't explored more than just knowing that you can have HTTP scaling or scaling based on queues. So if you have a web container like we have here, based on traffic, you can probably configure this to adjust the number of container instances automatically based on how much traffic you get. We're not going to do that now. But what I do want to do now, though, is at least to have a cancel. I have a cancel there. I want to still prove to you that this still works, that we have a running container that works all the way. Again, we got at least a temporary URL, and we got HTTPS for free, and we have our website running in a container. Oh, yes, we have 3 containers now. What have we done? 3 containers in half an hour. So less than like 10 minutes per container, you can get this whole stuff. And the first 10 minutes was prep time anyway. So this is really not complicated. It's just, you know, if you know where to click. And even if you don't know where to click, because I have to, again, like, kudos to Microsoft for making this easy. I know I want to create a resource, and I know I want to work with containers. Like, it guides you pretty well, and this is one of the reasons why I really like Azure. It gives you, things are reasonably named, and it guides you. It gives you a lot of guidance where you next steps should be. Where do you want to click to get your next step done? What we are going to do now, before we go any further, we're going to go back to our container instances, and we're going to shut down the one that pays per second, because I don't want to pay for it any more than I absolutely have to. And here I want to point out that the free trial account comes with like $200 worth of resource usage. So even though I'm paying per second, I'm actually not paying anything right now, because we're not paying, we haven't had it running long enough to actually cost more than hopefully a couple of kroner, or maybe 10 or 15. So here's my container instance, and I'm just going to stop that to stop costing money. Back to the presentation. So I've mentioned several times, I mentioned Kubernetes to you, and if you work with Docker or if you read up on Docker, you probably know that Kubernetes is a way to manage a whole cluster of containers. If you have a bunch of containers that need to work together, and you want to scale them, and you want to network them together, and you want them to be accessible from the outside world, there's things like, again, like load balancers and ingresses that come into play. We are not going to go into much more detail than that. I just wanted to be aware that if these first 3, like if you start out with them and you realize that was not enough for me, that's when you would go to AKS. If you know, like sometimes you may know it in advance. If you're working with a complex web of microservices, then you know that Azure Container Instances is not going to cut it. And you would also probably go to AKS straight away if you know you have microservices, but you don't quite feel comfortable with using a beta or preview product in production. So the other Azure Container Apps, which sounds really lovely, but may not be ready for prime time, that's when you would go here. But if you have a single container, or maybe like, I don't know, 2 or 3 simple containers, Kubernetes is overkill. Don't do it. Like, there's all these things you need to learn. Do it if you're curious, absolutely. Do it if you want to explore, but don't do it for solving a production problem where an Azure web app for containers is perfectly enough because you just need one web app in the cloud. Kubernetes is powerful, but there is a learning curve. There's like there's no point and click interface, for example. If you want to do it, you can create the cluster with a point and click. Actually, I can just demonstrate. If we go to containers again, like Kubernetes is all here, but the moment you pass the actual cluster creation, like here we're gonna like $signs coming up straight away. And the moment you like pass, like you're gonna need to choose Kubernetes versions here, and like there's primary node pool, like terminology like starts flooding in straight away. And also the moment you pass this first step, it's gonna give you an editor and like paste your YAML file here. So there is a learning curve. It's not just sort of go ahead and do it. Which doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but you should have a reason for doing it, in my opinion. And that reason may just be intellectual curiosity and then the desire to discover things. But it's definitely not on the same level as the other things. So not doing this today. It's not a beginner level thing. If you wanted to do it, then we'd need a whole session just for that. We can't fit it in alongside with 3 other offerings. So, overview, what have we gone through? 4 different options for putting containers in Azure. The first one, Azure Container Instances. Clearly most basic, not much in terms of bells and whistles and knobs to tweak. Pay per second, which makes it awesome for temporary, short-lived workloads of any kind. Data processing jobs, build agents, batch jobs, things you would like run as a batch job on your computer, but you want it maybe at a larger scale or maybe more instances than just one. Don't forget to shut it down when you're done, because otherwise the pay per second doesn't really help you. Azure Web Apps for Containers, optimized for web workloads, gives you lots of nice web appropriate things for free, things like such as deployment slots, SSL support, app settings, and I'm sure plenty more that I've forgotten to mention, logging, SSH access, and so on. Third option, Azure Container Apps. Currently in beta, might be the future, might be the way forward. Powered by Kubernetes and marketed as microservice friendly, and may take over I imagine it may take over in many cases where currently you have to use AKS because you need these containers collaborating and working with each other. But, you know, serverless, so much of the administrative detail is hidden away from you and you don't need to care about it. You need to care more than with the others, but less than with actually using AKS. And then the option that we didn't dive into in detail, Azure Kubernetes Services or AKS. This is what you would use for microservices before the coming of Azure Container Apps. And you would use it in the future if you need or want to manage your own cluster and administer the details and get to use your Kubernetes tools that you're familiar with. Also, probably if you currently have a Kubernetes cluster elsewhere, not in Azure, and you want to move to Azure, then this may be a simpler transition than going to container apps, which may be sort of more user-friendly. But if you already have the Kubernetes knowledge, then it's an easier shift to just do the same thing, but in Azure. That was it. Thank you. Any questions? Any questions?
Sorry, if you have questions, please repeat what they say.
Yes?
And you can raise your hand.
No hands? Mikael, I'm sure you listened very attentively. Do you have any questions about Azure?
It was pretty straightforward.
Do you think you can do it?
Yes.
I'm glad to hear that. Henrik?
Kind of, not exactly about your presentation, but what puzzles me a bit about this is where would you recommend for the information how to integrate this in your deployment workflow that you say, as opposed to on-prem thing, you need to work with the URL and you need to like all that stuff. Where should I look for that?
So where should you look for information to integrate these container offerings in Azure into your existing on-prem and other sort of workflow? I would
Not just setting up the containers, but also like actually working with them and
working.
like in a workflow.
Yes, and I would like to again point you towards Microsoft documentation. I can't remember which one of these, but I think at least AKS has specifically, there are tutorials pages of like VNets and how you integrate it with possibly networks, VNets that have some of your stuff on-prem and some are in the cloud. And there is pretty good support for that. It's not something I've used, but I would start with the Microsoft documentation, because it's like, it's not documentation just about the product, but also like architectural thinking and how do you approach doing things in the cloud.
Yeah,
Yes. I haven't tried myself though. You had a question?
I got my answer.
Excellent. 2 in 1. There was a hand over there. Yes?
Yeah. Say for example, if Michael, let's take an example, can go home now and try this out. And he recognizes that, yes, I'm going to create a web page to promote my Christmas party at home. Is this one of the ways you would do it? Is there even a physical way to get the page up and down?
So Michael wants to create a web page to market our Christmas party, and he wants it in the cloud. The offerings here are not the simplest way to do it. These are the offerings that assume that you're already working with Docker. So you have some working knowledge of Docker, and you have your web page in a Docker container. And I'm not going to go into all the arguments why Docker is great. Docker is great. But if all you have is a simple web page, then you don't actually need it. For example, Azure also has static websites, which you just host in Azure blob storage. I think it must be blob storage, Azure storage basically. So you create a storage container, which you can think of as like a hard drive on the web. And you just upload your website into that thing, and you say, make this available on this URL. So then you can even skip the whole container layer. That's even simpler than that. But at the same time, like Docker is not hard. So if we're one step up from Michael's very temporary website, if you have something that you might actually have multiple developers working on, then Docker makes sense, because maybe one of your developers loves Mac and another one sits on a Windows machine, and then they fight and say, oh, we should all do Windows, and no, we should not. And then Docker helps you solve that problem. Each one of them can work on the same website, one on Windows, one on Mac, both are happy. And it goes into the cloud that sits on Linux, and everybody's still happy, because Docker sort of swipes away all that complexity of it works on my machine but not on yours. So my message is Michael should also learn Docker, but he doesn't need to. Any more questions? Yes, please.
How is this, the container apps, is compared with Azure Functions?
How is container apps compared to Azure Functions? I guess they're kind of for different scenarios. I would more compare Azure Functions to container instances, because it's like for a workload that runs and then is done and then it stops. Although Azure Container Apps can also be triggered by queue events. So I guess depending on how complex the thing is that you want to make happen, if it's just a single container, then I think or if it's just a very simple workload, then Azure Functions or a container instance. But if it's multiple that need to work together, or again, you want to work with scaling, then I guess the container apps would be something to look at. There's not always one right answer for these. And actually, like fangirling Microsoft documentation here again, there are even pages where they discuss exactly this. How do I choose between this and that? In what scenarios would I pick any of these? With specific like examples of, okay, if you have, you know, a queue or an event-driven workload, you should use one of these. If not, if it's a web app, you should use one of these. But they do overlap the use cases, so it's not always like one answer is right. There's often multiple options that would work well for you. Any more hands up? One very small finger up. Yes.
Vertical scaling.
Sorry?
Vertical scaling.
Vertical scaling.
If you want to give the container more memory or process CPU, if you can do that without downtime.
If you can vertically scale your containers without downtime, I can answer for sure that you can do it with the web apps for containers because if you use deployment slots. And I'm pretty sure that the others offerings also scale, possibly not without downtime, but like maybe like a stutter in response time. But maybe like not completely without downtime. But the deployment slots and also in the container apps, you have the revisions, which should also help you do that. So you can scale them. Although the revisions, I'm not sure how much the vertical scaling was there. Maybe it's just the scale out there rather than scale up.
But you shouldn't have to rebuild the whole.
You don't have to rebuild everything. No, you can just go in and tweak it. Possibly you get slower responses while things are starting up, or if you have deployment slots, then you scale one and then afterwards scale the other. Any more cautious fingers in the air? Everybody's answered? All right. In that case, I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you go home and have fun with Azure.